everyone, welcome back to Too Sweet MTG and welcome to another video. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over a black version of DanDan that I've made that I think you might just like. I've had a lot of fun building it and playing it at home. It's actually been the vast amount of Magic that I've been playing recently, as it is really cool. So today I'm going to be showing you what I've built. Before we jump in though, I'm assuming if you clicked on this video you probably already know what DanDan is, but for those who don't, we'll quickly go over that. Basically, DanDan is kind of like a mini board game of Magic made up of 80 cards, where both players share a library and share a graveyard. As you're both playing with the same deck, cards that interact with the library, kind of like control what's on top of it, become way more powerful. In DanDan, a card like Memory Lapse is really strong. There's not only like a tempo counterspell, but if you counter something good, it goes on top of your library and then you get to draw it. So it has a lot of cool interactions and cool play. DanDan is like a blue version of a tempo mirror. Now I love the graveyard. I will play Dredge in any format where I physically can. So I wanted to build something that revolved around the graveyard because it's also a shared graveyard. And it's not really something that DanDan takes full advantage of, and it's definitely something I have lent into. And importantly, like DanDan, the idea of this game is that it is still Magic. It is a condensed board game little thing version of Magic, but it is still Magic at its heart. Everything needs to follow the rules. So basically, if you play Magic, you know how to play this. Right, so we jumped over to Tap. Obviously, a link to this will be down in the description below. I'll go over the key cards and kind of what you're trying to do. Probably the most important place to start is just knowing that the game starts with a Howling Mine in play. Basically, this makes every player draw an extra card. The reason for this is because basically, it just gives you more cards to use in a game and just makes it a bit more fun. Black doesn't have anywhere near as much card draw that blue does, so this is just basically a way of keeping everything smooth, making sure players get lands and spells so they can actually play the game. Think of it like an emblem or like a plane from Plane Chase that just kind of sits there like a world enchantment and just affects everything that's going on. Right, so with that, let's go over the main list. It wouldn't be DanDan without a signature creature. Our signature creature in this is Barrow Ghoul. Barrow Ghoul is 1 black for a 4/4 creature zombie, with the ability and drawback of, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Barrow Ghoul unless you exile the top creature card of your graveyard. So importantly with this, there has to be a creature card that the Barrow Ghoul can eat from the graveyard to put it into exile, otherwise you sacrifice the Barrow Ghoul in your upkeep. There's a ton of cool things that you can do with this card, as it basically turns graveyard manipulation, cards that can remove creatures from graveyards at instant speed, into removal spells for the Barrow Ghoul. One thing I also like about this is that similar to DanDan, it has 4 power. So with this whole version, I've tried to keep that part similar in that everything's in multiples of 4. So like with DanDan, you only need to deal 5 hits of 4 damage. You don't have to keep track of life totals. Basically everything in this game is multiples of 4 damage. Another thing that's important with the Barrow Ghoul is that it does specifically say the top creature of your graveyard. That means graveyard orders matters. Let's go. This isn't anywhere near as much as a faff as you might be worrying that it is. Basically, the way we do it is we have the 2 players opposite each other, then we have the deck, and just in the middle, we have the shared graveyard running along the middle of the table. It keeps things nice and easy. The other drawback of Barrow Ghoul that might not be initially apparent is that basically the way the play pattern of this works is that without anything else, you always want to be the second person to play your Barrow Ghoul because there needs to be something in the graveyard for it to eat. If you just play a Barrow Ghoul on an empty board, it'll just die on your upkeep because there's nothing for it to exile. So the way we've gotten around this, which adds a lot of interesting points to the game, is we are running random discard effects. So we have Hymn to Torak, and we have Whispers of Emrakul, which is kind of like a slightly worse Hymn to Torak, but it's even more budget and it is slightly easier to cast because it's not double black. The element of randomness that Whispers of Emrakul and Hymn to Torak bring, I actually quite like. If you were running something like Thoughtseize and you knew perfectly what was in your opponent's hands, it kind of makes the game a bit less fun. There's the element of bluffing. Like when we get to the top of the deck manipulation cards, they get way more interesting when you only know a couple of cards in your opponent's hand, when you don't know the whole thing. And basically the idea with these is that you are using these random discard spells to put your opponent's creatures from their hand into the graveyard so you have fuel for your Barrow Ghoul. We're also running 2 Dream Salvage. Basically, this is a way of rewarding you for making you make your opponent discard cards. So if you Hymn to Torak them, they discard 2 cards at random. You then play a Dream Salvage, you draw 2 cards at instant speed. That's pretty good. There are other instant speed card draw spells in black, but a lot of them make you lose life in multiples that are not 4, which kind of throws off the math from the Barrow Ghoul. I wanted to keep that nice and neat. So that's kind of the early parts of the game. You're making your opponent discard cards to fuel up the graveyard so you can play your Barrow Ghouls so it can stick around and start beating down your opponents. The next section is the all-important kind of instant speed interaction, mucking up with the graveyard, taking cards and putting them on top of your library. Because if you can remove cards from the graveyard, it means your opponent, if they have a Barrow Ghoul out, if you instant speed remove the creature that they were planning on eating, their Barrow Ghoul dies and then you can play your one and then yours has fuel. Fantastic. So by far, the best card at this is Misinformation. Misinformation is 1 black mana for an instant, Put up to 3 target cards from an opponent's graveyard on top of their library in any order. Remember, it's a shared graveyard, so this also affects you as well. But say, for example, your opponent has 2 Barrow Ghouls out and there are 2 creatures in the graveyard ready for them to eat. On upkeep at instant speed, you can cast Misinformation. You can put those cards from the graveyard back on top of your library. There's then nothing for the Barrow Ghouls to eat, so they die. Honestly, Misinformation is a house of a card in this format. There's some other cool ways of mucking up the graveyard on the top of the library. We have Grave Purge, which lets you put any number of target creature cards on the top of your library, and also draws you a card, again, all at instant speed. So say, for example, your opponent had 1 Barrow Ghoul, and there was 1 in the graveyard that they were planning on eating. You could steal it, put it on top of the library, you then draw it, theirs dies, again, you have fuel for your 1, ready to play and swing through. There is also Corpse Churn as a bit of self-mill. You could definitely run more of these if you weren't a big fan of the discard spells, but we'll get on to why I really like the discard spells in a little moment. And the last bit of graveyard manipulation is Pull from Eternity. We do have some white sources, I'll go over those when we get to the land section, but this lets you take a card that's already been exiled, like a Barrow Ghoul or another creature that's already been eaten, and put it back into the graveyard so you have something to fuel your own one. This is really a nice little addition and has been very solid. Probably worth touching on just another creature that we're running. We're running Activated Sleeper. This is 2 and a black for a flash 0/0 Phyrexian Shapeshifter that comes into play as a copy of a creature that has died this turn. So say, for example, there wasn't any fuel in the graveyard for your opponent's Barrow Ghoul, they had to sacrifice it on their upkeep. You can then flash this in, and then you get 1, and there's already something in the graveyard for it to eat. Also, because black is nowhere near as good as blue in terms of instant speed, kind of creatures and interaction, just having an additional creature with flash is really nice here. It's just another way of doing something that your opponents don't see coming. Right, we'll go over the removal now. Of all the sections, this one is definitely the most likely where you could change it up and kind of play around with it and make it your own. Chainer's Edict is just a really solid edict effect. Like in this format, people generally don't have too many of creatures in play at the same time. Because effectively, these graveyard manipulations are also removal for Barrow Ghouls on top of the ones we already have. So a lot of the time, Chainer's Edict really does answer the thing that you want it to. Also, the fact it has flashback, and again, it's a shared graveyard, means that late game, it adds an extra little dimension to the game that you have to think about. And also, because flashback exiles it, you can pull from Eternity a Chainer's Edict back into the graveyard to kill something that way. It's a lot of mana, but with the Howling Mine, people are generally hitting their land drops, which is quite nice. Force of Despair has been a fine card. Of all of them, this is the easiest to cut, if I'm honest with you. Basically, I wanted an instant speed, kind of mini board wipe answer to a lot of things. But this could easily be something like a Languish if you just want a straight good fashion board wipe that's nice and cheap, as everything in this is a 4/4. Foul Renewal is a really awesome bit of interaction. Basically, this is like the biggest 2-for-1 in this whole deck. It's 3 and a black for an instant. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the toughness of the card returned this way. So if your opponent has any kind of board state, you can nab a Barrow Ghoul out of the graveyard before it gets eaten. You can kill their creature. You get the Barrow Ghoul back to your hand. Again, it's putting their one in the graveyard. Like when you get this off, it's a very powerful 2-for-1. You are getting a creature card, a relevant creature card into your hand, and you are killing their creature. We then have Murderous Cut. This could actually be a little bit too good. Like the Delve can really just eat so much of the graveyard. But again, this is a card that's probably more playable now that Howling Mine is just sitting there drawing everyone multiple cards a turn, because it just means the graveyard's going to get bigger and bigger. So Murderous Cut is very solid. Before we go on to the lands, there's probably a section that some eagle-eyed among you might have noticed I haven't gone over yet. And that is our discard punishment spells. So these are spells that you cannot cast. They can only be brought into play by someone making you discard them. The discard is at random, which adds a nice little level of like gambling, ooh, I'm in to it. So we are running 2 Loxodon Smiter, which is 1 a green and a white for a 4/4 creature elephant soldier. It can't be countered. And most importantly of all, if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard the Smiter, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. It importantly is also a 4/4, so it trades nicely with the Barrow Ghoul, but importantly, it doesn't have any downside when it is in play. The other card we're running is Guerrilla Tactics. Again, you cannot cast this card, it can only be brought into play by someone making the other player discard it. It is 1 red, that doesn't matter. For an instant, Guerrilla Tactics deals 2 damage to target creature or player. That is never coming up. The main part is, whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Guerrilla Tactics deals 4 damage to target creature or player. So this little package here, these 6 cards, is 6 cards out of 80, so it's not massive, but it does come up probably like once or twice a game. This adds something to this variant that I don't think I have seen before, and is really, really fun. Basically, there's risk, there's jeopardy. If you're making your opponent discard a card at random, you might hit one of these. You might give them a 4/4 that is like the best creature on the board, or you might give them a Guerrilla Tactics. A Guerrilla Tactics is a 5th of their life totals. It's 1 DanDan point, as it were. Or it's guaranteed to kill any creature on the board. This is by far one of the most unique things I think about this variant, and I think it kind of, if I'm honest, it puts it above quite a lot of the other ones. In my own opinion anyway, I am going to be a little biased on this. You feel like you're risking something when you do it. It's not just a free, oh, I him you, there is no downside. Like late game, you could be nugged for 4 and that could take you out of a game. Or if you do it early, they could put down a Loxodon Smiter and then you're in a lot of trouble. Part of my thinking with this little section here is that if you just make a straight version of DanDan that's mono black, it's going to be worse than DanDan, because blue does some things better than black. I personally think that with the Graveyard Matters stuff of the Barrow Ghoul and the misinformations, combined with like this pseudo-gambling mechanic of him to Toraking, Whispers of Emrakul, making them discard cards at random, most of the time, for about 80-90% of the time, it's going to be fine. You're going to get something that you want, or you're going to get like a land or a removal spell that kind of fills up the Whispers of Emrakul to turn on Delirium, make it that little bit better. There's a small fraction of the time when it will go wrong and you'll get one of these. It really adds something unique, and I really think it's a very cool and fun element to this variant. From all the games I've played with it, no one has ever got annoyed when something like this has happened, when someone's hit a Smiter or when they've been nugged for 4 by a Guerrilla Tactics. Everyone has accepted that's part of the game, it's a risk that we're doing. And when it does happen, it's a big moment in the game. It's a cool thing that you aren't really expecting to happen, and it comes out of nowhere and is really fun. Also, if your opponent does land a turn 2 Loxodon Smiter because you him them on turn 2 and you unfortunately hit it, like all this removal does get rid of it. Chainer's Edict is only 2 mana. Foul Renewal is a 2-for-1, so there's plenty of opportunities for you to kill the Loxodon Smiter. Also, you can just block with a Barrow Ghoul. Everything is a 4-4 in this format. But there is also way more play to these cards than you might initially think. So, later in the game, when you have less cards in hand, for example, if a Loxodon Smiter is in the graveyard, say it's been killed already, you could Grave Purge it, put it back on top of your library, you then draw it, it's then in your hand, your opponent might hit it at random, and then you get it into play. Same with something like Corpse Churn, same with Misinformation and combined with like a Cycling Land. You as the player have the ability to heighten the chances of these being hit. It's something that you know about, but your opponent doesn't, so you can make them more likely to happen. In a way similar to poker, or also Magic the Gathering. You can control the RNG to an extent to make it come out in your favour. Alright, let's quickly go over the lands. This is pretty standard fare. So we have 12 Swamps, we have 4 Cycling Lands, we have 2 Barren Moor, 2 Polluted Mire, we have 2 Dakmor Salvage, because as I've said, I will play Dredge in absolutely everything. We have Ebon Stronghold as some nice ways of kind of giving you double mana, while also letting you sacrifice a land to put it into the graveyard, again to turn on Delirium. We have Mortuary Mire as kind of a sorcery speed way of putting a creature from your graveyard back on top of your library. Then for our white sources, we have Oars of Basilica. These bounce lands are just really good. And also they often mean you end up with more than 7 cards in hand, so you have to discard some, again fueling up the graveyard. And then we have Temple of Silence. Like, I was already running Temples before I decided to run Pull from Eternity. Just because it's free scry, it's free top of the deck manipulation, free top of the deck matters. They're just really solid in this. With this, I was trying to keep it relatively cheap. Like, I think this whole thing is on like TCG Player Marketplace is between $23 and $27, which is pretty reasonable. But yeah, before we finish up, I do kind of want to go over that, like, the games with this are really fun and really interactive. Like, similar to DanDan, there's a load of cool and interesting lines. Like, with the Howling Mine and people drawing too, you kind of have to think about, like, what up to 3 cards do I want to put on top of the library? What do I want to give my opponent? What do I want to get? Things like, what other spells do I want to exile with things like Murderous Cut? Like, how can I best orchestrate a position where my opponent makes me discard this Smiter and I get it into play for free? Like, because a card like Misinformation is so cheap, you can kind of end up with, like, mini proxy counterspell wars with these. Like, your opponent might try to cast one to kind of muck up your next couple of draws. Then you can cast one in response and kind of, so you can put some things into the graveyard first, mucking up what they're going to draw, and then they're left with the rest to pick from. And on top of all the really cool interaction that revolves around the graveyard and the top of the library, games can also be pretty swingy, which is quite fun. Like, your opponent can be beating you down, but if they run out of Barrow Ghouls, then all of their stuff dies, and then you have fuels for your ones when you're ready to play them. Like, I've seen a fair bit of discourse online about people kind of like, I think they've narrowed down that maybe Barrow Ghoul Misinformation is the way to go with it with the black version. I've seen people do some stuff with Icarid, which I think is quite cool, but I think the Misinformation Barrow Ghoul is just a really cool, neat little package that works very nicely. And I think what's cool about my version with this version is this discard element section is really unique. I personally feel that this really adds something to the game and is a unique, cool selling point that makes it fun to play and makes it its own. Right, as I mentioned, a link to this will be down in the description below. Let me know what you think. I would generally be interested to hear from people what they like about it, what they don't like about it. Like, do you like the gambling mechanics? Do you not like them? Like, if I'm honest, I'm not 100% on all the removal spells yet. Like, Force of Despair is good, but I think it could be improved upon. Let me know what you would add to it. I would really like to hear that. But until next time, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.